Good morning, everyone. My name is Marty Castro. I'm chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Good morning. We want to thank you all for being here and welcome you to the Commission's briefing on police practices and the use of deadly force. I'm going to go into some housekeeping matters, but before I get there, we have two presentations that we would like to share with you. First and foremost, we would like to invite to the podium to share welcoming remarks with us Jeremy Travis. Mr. Travis is the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is our host today. He is the fourth president of this university, but he also has a distinguished record of having served in the Clinton administration and been very involved in issues involving anti-crime efforts at the federal level, community policing, and new law enforcement technologies, which are obviously at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish today. So, President, would you please share with us a few welcoming remarks?
Thank you very much, Chairman Castro and members of the Commission and honored guests who are here today. It's a distinct pleasure for me to welcome all of you here today on behalf of the faculty, students, and alumni at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is a fitting opportunity for us to be reminded at the college of the 50 years of our existence. When we started 50 years ago, we were, Mr. Chairman, a small college offering liberal arts programs in the police academy of the New York City Police Department on the theory that an educational opportunity for young law enforcement officers was something important to their professional development. So here we are, 50 years later, welcoming the Commission on Civil Rights to this institution, and in an important way, I think, reminding all of us once again how important it is to bring new ideas and new thinking, new perspectives into the important work performed by our law enforcement officers around the country. I need not point out to the Commission that this is also timely, that you are having these discussions here today, and my hope is that your deliberations will help shed light on some of the challenges that our country is facing. Finally, just let me note how proud I am to see that as I look at your agenda, not only are a number of national experts testifying before the Commission today, but included in those experts are some John Jay faculty. So thank you for reaching out to our expertise to help in your discussions. So I wish you well and stand ready to help the Commission in any way that we can throughout the day and afterwards. And if you see me sitting in the back row, it's because I'm really, really interested in what you're doing. So,
okay, well, we won't use the Socratic method on you, so we'll let you slide. But thank you,
okay, thanks
Mr.
so much.
President, for your hospitality today. And next, I would like to ask one of our commissioners to give some opening remarks. And I would like to ask Dave Cladney, our commissioner from Nevada, to speak, because he's really the person who's been the driving force behind this hearing today and has worked extremely closely with our staff in our Office of Civil Rights Evaluation and our staff who actually put the logistics of this together. And I think it's only appropriate to hear from him before we really get started. Commissioner Cladney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's really no better place to hold this hearing than on police use of force than right here at John Jay College for criminal justice, nor is it more timely. Named for the first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay is a leading institution of higher education to prepare students for entering the criminal justice field. It is also the leading research institution in criminal justice. There are many people to thank for making our hearing possible today. First, a big thank you to President Jeremy Travis and the Chief of Staff, Rulisa Galloway Perry, for making the school available and working with our staff. We would also like to thank John Jay's staff, who have assisted in every way. We would also like to thank Angela French Bell and new father Sean Galladay of the Commission's Office of Civil Rights Evaluation, who put forth an extraordinary efforts to research the issues and identify the panelists we'll hear today. They have our deep appreciation, as does everyone on the Commission staff who worked so hard to make today happen. Most of all, I wish to thank Ms. Pam Dunstan, our Division Chief of Administration and Clearinghouse Services. It is not easy a job to move the Commission's entire briefing apparatus from our permanent hearing site in Washington, D.C. to a distant and unfamiliar place, needing to coordinate and resolve the smallest details to the largest issues necessary for us to conduct this important briefing. Pam, thank you very much. Your work is much appreciated. Our topic today is police practice and use of force. I always thought that America is a melting pot, and it's a place where people from different backgrounds come together to build a great nation. But Are we a melting pot, or are we different cultures and subcultures? Do we look upon each subculture with our own preconceived notions? The vision of a melting pot seems far away when citizens and law enforcement have confrontations like we've seen in Los Angeles and Cleveland, to Staten Island, and most recently, North Charleston and Tulsa. These confrontations allegedly range from justified to accidental to intentional. Yet, each one of them plays into the narrative ingrained in the communities that were historically targeted by law enforcement. They also play into the police culture narrative of guardians who are always in danger. When parts of our society feel they are automatically suspected and constantly under threat, it hurts us all. When there is a lack of respect and dialogue, it furthers these perceptions. Remember, perceptions is truth to those with preconceived notions. The lack of transparent investigations, with police policing police and a legal system that keeps the evidence secret, feeds the narrative of oppression of minority citizens. Law enforcement is a tough job. A good majority of police do it well. We should, and they should, hold themselves to the highest of standards. We trust them to enforce our laws fairly while giving them a monopoly on use of deadly force. It is not just a job. They are professionals and they should be treated that way. Efforts to improve the application of use of force cannot come at the expense of officer safety. Most police officers do their jobs well, treating people they encounter with respect and using methods they have learned to keep themselves and citizens safe. Police chiefs and sheriffs are tasked with making sure their officers are well trained and conduct themselves appropriately. Failure to monitor officer conduct is a failure of supervision. Both officer and citizen safety are of utmost importance. But what should be done? This is the question we seek to answer today. We know the best and safest policing occurs when there is trust between police and the communities they serve. It is always difficult when cultures face change. Hopefully today we can contribute to the idea of creating a better America. There is a way forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. So this morning, in terms of the commissioners who are present, I am joined obviously by Commissioner Cladney, but also by our Vice Chair, Patricia Timmons-Goodson, and Commissioners Narasaki, Axenberg, and Yaki. Commissioner Kurzenow could not be with us today, so he sends his regrets. Now, as you know, the purpose of this hearing is very clear. We are going to discuss with some very distinguished panelists some important information about the happenings that we've seen across the country. As Commissioner Cladney said, a majority of police officers do an overwhelmingly good job. They do their job. They serve us. They protect us. They risk their lives every day. Yet a frightening number of our police officers do not, especially when it comes to interactions with communities of color. And that's why we're here today as the United States Commission on Civil Rights. As Justice Warren said, police must obey the law while they are enforcing the law. And too many men of color are dying at the hands of police officers nationwide, whether it's Ferguson or Bosco. And many of these fatal interactions are now being caught on the technologies that we all carry with us, cell phones and cell phone cameras. So these interactions cannot be covered up. They cannot be dismissed away. They must be addressed in the light of day by organizations such as ours. And I say these are our police forces because they are made up of members of our community. They're here to protect us. They're here to serve us. Yet, in communities of color, they are becoming a judge, jury, and unfortunately executioner. Many of us, myself included, have been victims of police overreaching and misconduct that have not been addressed. So we've looked at this issue before. Our Missouri SAC recently held a hearing in February in St. Louis County on what happened in Ferguson, as well as other issues involving Missouri. And some of the work that we're going to do today is informed by their work and their initial investigations. And I thank them for providing us with a quick report, interim report, so that we had that in advance of today's hearing, and we will expect a more full report from them. But we are not here today to accuse or indict. We're here to educate, learn, elucidate, and come up with best practices from each and every one of you that we can then recommend to the President and Congress and to the country as a whole to hopefully, if not eliminate this, but substantially reduce this kind of violence and fatal interactions we're seeing between our police officers and communities of color. So today we have a distinguished panel. Number of panels is made up of 24 speakers who are going to provide us with their diverse array of views and perspectives. The speakers have been divided into 5 panels. Panel 1 will consist of community leaders, civilian review boards, and police organizations. Panel 2 will consist of law enforcement officials and experts on police accountability and the use of force. Panel 3 will include court officials and experts on procedural justice and legal reforms. Panel 4 will discuss federal agencies and federally funded initiatives. And Panel 5 will conclude with researchers and data collection experts. Each panelist during their presentations initially will have 7 minutes to speak. You'll see a series of warning lights. Green, of course, go. Yellow, begin to wrap up. And red, we would ask that you stop. That doesn't mean that's all you're going to say. We will then have the opportunity to have commissioners interchange and interact with you through question and answers. And that is where we usually elicit most of the information that results in what we consider to be a thoughtful dialogue on these topics. Commissioners will then have the opportunity to be selected by me to speak. We're going to ask them to, as we have in the past, be mindful of the time as well as the ability to ask, let other commissioners ask questions. So with that done, what I would like to do is just inform everyone that once we're done here, we're going to keep this record open for the next 30 days. If panelists or members of the public would like to add information, they can either do it by mailing it to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of Federal Civil Rights Evaluation, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C., 20425, or via email at puf_briefingcomments@usccr.gov. That's puf_briefingcomments@usccr.gov. With that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to now present the first panel. Our first panelist this morning is Ms. Talila Lewis with Helping Educate to Advance the Rights of the Deaf. Our second panelist is Mr. Richard Davis with the ARC, a National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. Our third panelist is Mr. Montague Simmons with the Organization for Black Struggle. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Felix Vargas with Consejo Latino. And our fifth panelist is Mr. Matthew Fogg with the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And our sixth and final panelist for this panel is Mr. Sean Smoot with the Police, Benevolent, and Protective Association of Illinois. I would now ask the panelists to raise your right hand and swear or affirm that the information that you're about to provide to us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Lewis, please proceed.
Good morning.
Morning.
And thank you for this opportunity to share testimony. I begin with a grim reminder that more than half of the people killed annually by law enforcement are people with disabilities. Michelle Cusseau, Milton Hall, even Eric Garner are some of the names you might recognize. Individuals with many types of disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, diabetes, epilepsy, and deafness, face violent and often deadly consequences when law enforcement fails to follow federal disability rights laws and nationally recognized best practices of policing, safe policing for people with disabilities. People with disabilities who belong to multiple marginalized communities are assaulted and killed by law enforcement at disproportionately higher rates than their non-disabled peers, for example, for being a person of color with a disability and or for being a person of a different class with a disability. It's important to note that 1 in 4 people in the United States, at least 1 in 4 people in the United States are people with disabilities. People with disabilities also represent the largest minority group within our prison and jail systems, with studies estimating that some 80+% of our incarcerated population are people with 1 or more disabilities. Police officers also report spending disproportionate amounts of time and resources responding to calls involving people with mental illness. And law enforcement's role in responding to individuals with mental illness has increased over the past several decades, with some cities' police departments spending more time responding to calls involving mental illness than they do for investigation of serious crimes. Last year, the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights convened a bipartisan hearing to address these very issues. The discussion explored best practices, including de-escalation and critical intervention, which we'll discuss, and my colleague here also will discuss more in depth. The importance of the Americans with Disabilities Act as related to the enhancement of police procedures in interacting with people with disabilities, the need to forge partnerships between law enforcement, mental health, and disability communities, the role of the United States Department of Justice in ensuring that enforcement of federal disability rights laws and acting in accordance with these laws and setting up procedures and national standards for the same. Despite the prevalence of police brutality against people with disabilities, police officers report feeling underprepared or unprepared to manage this special population. For example, California's Police Academy recruits spend a mere 6 hours out of 664 hours that are required for training with each Police Academy class. Upon graduation, there's no requirement by law or even by the commission that sets up training for periodic review of training or periodic updates to whatever they have learned in those 6 hours that they spent learning about disability. We've also seen an alarming increase that's worth noting in exoneration of people with disabilities, whether that's people who are deaf, people with mental disabilities, all of those included. We're seeing a spike in exonerations of these groups, which really brings to bear questions about not just law enforcement's capability of managing and interacting with people with disabilities, but the entire justice system's ability to manage the same population. There are some examples in my written comment about some of the miscommunications that occur between people who are deaf, people with disabilities, and law enforcement. I will fast forward through that so I can get to the recommendations. There are safe ways to interact with people with disabilities, and it's been proven time and time again throughout the nation. There are locations in the nation that are working to implement policies and procedures that are safe in dealing with people with disabilities. Some of these are crisis intervention, de-escalation tools, including calm and diverse methods of communication, collaboration with mental health resources and disability rights resources, physical containment of individuals from a distance, and patience. Perhaps most important is the fact that federal disability rights laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires non-discrimination and reasonable modification in all policing activities. Law enforcement compliance with Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act is critical to promoting public safety and equal access to justice. The ADA is landmark civil rights law that, among other things, requires police departments to take appropriate steps to guarantee that people with disabilities have equal access to programs, activities, and services. It's an affirmative obligation that includes providing reasonable accommodations and modifications and adequate training for police officers working with the same population. Some of the recommendations that I've provided include an intentional infusion of diversity into our justice system. And what that means is deaf and disabled people should be working in tandem with, as consultants for law enforcement across the nation. The Department of Justice should be establishing some minimum national standards and devising some sort of training that would be provided to police departments, sheriff's departments across the nation, just so that there's a minimum standard in place. All police departments should be required to adopt general orders for safe and non-discriminatory interactions with people with disabilities. I'll skip through a couple. Mental health courts should be used as an alternative, a cost-effective alternative to incarceration for people with disabilities. Police departments should implement crisis intervention and de-escalation strategies, including the use of time, communication, coordination, and containment to reach non-lethal resolutions to conflicts and confrontations. The Department of Justice should resolve to collect more complete and detailed information on quote-unquote justifiable homicides, and also provide statistics regarding disability status of each of the deceased persons in those cases. Officers who do not follow procedures as related to federal disability rights laws should be held fully accountable and prosecuted where necessary. Mental health agencies should be assigned the ultimate responsibility for care of persons with mental illness in their communities and held accountable. In addition to that, and kind of in tandem, is that we want to see more community-based care and funding thereof. And finally, we'd like to see legislatures ensuring that law enforcement receive adequate training on individuals with disabilities and mental health crisis intervention, cultural competency and sensitivity, de-escalation and intervention training, and funding of community-based mental health treatment
Thank
programs.
you, Ms. Lewis. I'm sorry I have to.
No, thank you.
We have your written statement as well, so all of those recommendations you have there will also be part of our record.
Thank you.
Which we will look closely at. Mr. Davis?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Castro and members of the Commission. My name is Richard Davis. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the ARC Maryland and also the team leader for the state's Disability Response Team with the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. The ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, or NCCJD, is a training and technical assistance center funded by the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and we're thankful for the opportunity to provide testimony for this briefing concerning people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, in relation to police practices and use of force. The National Center is the first national effort to bring together both victim and suspect offender issues involving people with IDD in one comprehensive effort to educate criminal justice professionals. The National Center partners with criminal justice professionals, including law enforcement and their respective national organizations such as IACP, to create the Pathways to Justice training program, fact sheets, white papers, and training materials, as well as provide information and referral and technical assistance addressing public safety issues. NCCJD is accumulating a robust clearinghouse of information and has already begun assessing promising practices regarding law enforcement training on disability issues from across the country. The National Center commends the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights on their recognition of this burgeoning human rights issue at a time when increasing numbers of individuals with disabilities are transitioning from institutional to community living. Through NCCJD's information and referral process, we've seen individuals with disabilities treated unjustly at several intercepts of the criminal justice system. Perhaps one of the most notorious and tragic recent examples is the story of Ethan Saylor's first contact with the criminal justice system. Ethan Saylor was a young man with Down syndrome from Frederick, Maryland. His first contact with police came when he tried to stay in a movie theater to see a second showing of Zero Dark 30. The theater manager complained to 3 off-duty officers working as security, and their arrival quickly escalated into a violent confrontation. Despite requests from Ethan's support staff to wait, Ethan's mother was a phone call and a short drive away. The officers tried to handle the situation. The exact sequence of events is in dispute, but before the evening ended, Ethan was dead due to asphyxiation when he was placed in prone restraint. Ethan's case highlights the critical need for law enforcement to have more meaningful, direct experience with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and a willingness to use less intrusive, non-lethal, non-traditional approaches when interacting with citizens with disabilities. More than 54 million Americans have a disability, comprising the largest minority group in the country. Of those 54 million, roughly 2 to 3% have an intellectual disability. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities may have familiar diagnoses such as autism, Down syndrome, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or they may have no particular diagnosis associated with their disability. The National Center on Criminal Justice and Disabilities identified 3 main challenges. First is inconsistency in training. Despite efforts of the ARC, other nonprofits, and police agencies over the past 20 to 25 years, there remains a lack of consistent, ongoing training for all criminal justice professionals on intellectual and developmental disabilities. Secondly is disparity in training content. There's considerably more law enforcement training available on mental illness than intellectual and developmental disability. People with IDD have distinct needs, both as suspects, offenders, and victims, different from persons with mental illness. Therefore, specific training on IDD is needed if officers are to feel confident when working with this population. Third is an unusually high rates of victimization. People with disabilities are especially vulnerable to victimization or manipulation by others, sometimes leading to criminal activity or patterns of victimization. Among disability types measured, persons with cognitive disabilities had the highest rate of violent victimization, 30 per 1,000 or 3%. People with cognitive disabilities such as intellectual disability and developmental disabilities such as cerebral palsy represented the largest group of victims. When police officers fail to handle emergency situations involving victims with intellectual and developmental disabilities appropriately, the chances of offenders remaining at large and reoffending greatly increases. To protect the public safety, law enforcement needs specialized training on effectively working with victims with disabilities. To foster better relationships between persons with disabilities and law enforcement, effective training needs to focus on relationship building. Training must not focus on law enforcement to diagnose disabilities, but on creating a better awareness about people with disabilities and assisting officers in creating an attitude of doing what it takes to ensure understanding of the citizens being served. Building principles of inclusion into the training, as well as how the training is incorporated into policing overall, can help remedy misperceptions from both the officer and the person with the disability and avoid future tragedies from happening in our communities. The National Center's Disability Response Teams, or DRTs, offer an evidence-based approach to this issue. When an individual who has different needs or communicates differently becomes involved in a complex system with many moving parts, tapping the expertise of multiple parties within the criminal justice system facilitates the smoothest possible outcome. Utilizing the promising practices seen across person-centered planning and healthcare to develop personalized justice plans, and also in the Office for Victims of Crime materials on assisting crime victims with disabilities, the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability is supporting the evidence-based approach of training multidisciplinary disability response teams to bring together criminal justice professionals, including law enforcement, legal professionals, and victim advocates, disability professionals, people with disabilities, and their family members to share expertise on behalf of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. NCCJD believes that criminal justice professionals who develop personal relationships with people with disabilities in their own communities can make a positive impact that will reduce the number of miscommunications, needless arrests, overlooked victims, and possibly deaths of people with disabilities. In conclusion, to ultimately prioritize the safety of people with disabilities as well as officers, there are promising practices all along the spectrum of interactions between law enforcement and people with IDD. Great thinkers have said that true peace is not merely the absence of tension, but it is the presence of justice, and that peace cannot be kept by force, it can only be achieved by understanding. It is with this in mind that we hope to build a safer, more just and inclusive society for people with disabilities to live safely and peacefully with the men and women of law enforcement in their communities. Thank you very much for considering our views on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Simmons?
First and foremost, thank you to members of the Commission and to our host here, John Jay. On behalf of the Organization for the Black Struggle, the community of organizers and activists who we've stood shoulder to shoulder with for years, and the national community of activists who've actually come to stand with us since August 9th. We've actually worked to create a front of resistance that has come to be known as Ferguson. We thank you for this invitation and thank you for casting the eyes of your commission on our community. I owe you a personal debt of thanks for making it clear that we who actually live in St. Louis, whether it's the Fergusons, Pine Lawns, Berkeley's, Northwoods, Velda Villages, or countless municipalities throughout the county their countless boys and girls grew up, myself included, feeling like prey, because the police in our city stalked those of us who look like us, for pleasure and for profit. But there was actually no remedy for us specifically to be sought under our democracy. I remember in my own younger days when the harassment seemed like it was daily. Just walking home from school or from the bowling alley, it could result in some form of intimidation, humiliation, or harassment. For us, this was a rite of passage that our brothers, mothers, fathers, cousins, and uncles did their best to prepare us for. They knew what happened when there were more than two of us. They knew what could happen if it was just one of us. They warned us about driving 35 miles in a 30-mile-an-hour zone on Lucas and Hunt. They warned us about every nook and cranny where they could be hiding, whether it was on Hanley Road or behind North Oak Shopping Center. They created routes for us to travel in and out of the communities when there were ongoing insurance checks, sobriety checks, that were usually prerequisites for a continuing shakedown for money. This, for us, has always been a generational affair. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has now cast its eyes upon our community because of the execution of Mike Brown, the corrupt and inept and racist investigation that followed, the investigation that ended in a fiasco of a grand jury that would have amounted to business as usual, except for the anger, tenacity, and determination of the people who've been in the streets for over 250 days. What happened in Ferguson is a structural feature of our criminal justice system, not a bug, glitch, or anomaly. The social toxins of militarization, racism, marketization are in full bloom on almost every street in America. We have law enforcement bodies bringing to bear military force on citizens. We have that force falling most heavily on people of color, protesters, dissidents, and other traditional targets of racist and xenophobic bullies, all of which being supercharged by structures in many cases that are fully dependent on these profits. We are not here in the interest of police reform, because it never has and never will work. We want a full transformation of our policing systems. That means reimagining every aspect of policing authority. Presently, our police are trained in general to restrain and kill citizens, protect personal property, and disperse crowds. This structure does not hold officers who violate our First and Fourth Amendment rights accountable. And onto this oppressive system, we've grafted a profit incentive. No collection of incremental and unconnected changes are going to transform such a system into one where police are public servants who protect our civil and human rights as members of an accountable, responsive entity that works in partnership with civilian communities. The Organization for Black Struggle has designed a quality policing initiative that creates deep partnership between the community and police at all levels, and specifically in all 5 phases of policing: recruitment, training, deployment, accountability, and advancement. At minimum, we'd want to see residency requirements, conflict resolution and threat progression training, demilitarization of all forces, including a specific withdrawal from the Department of Defense's 1033 program, stopping the use of police as collection agents, implementation of field contact cards that allow us to track every interaction, an early warning system database on police behavior, a media accountability system that includes body and dash cameras where the data is actually controlled by civilian review boards and civilian accountability projects, and a civilian accountability project that has subpoena power, investigatory, and prosecution powers. The board has to have a relationship and a role in developing police policies and setting standards. We've attached the full initiative to our statement. The challenge for us, and for those of us who have actually committed to this fight, is that most of the recommendations that we offer are not new. In fact, over the last 50 years, crisis after crisis has resulted in similar recommendations from sources that include this very commission, but they continue to go unheeded. My parents came of age during the reconstruction of our culture and democracy that took place in the late 50s and 60s. During that period, evils were exposed, lives were lost, communities were transformed with the hope that justice would prevail for generations yet unborn. Yet today, in 2015, the promises of real justice are as of yet unfulfilled. Our communities are now subject to institutionalized state violence, and they have no path for remedy or haven from the assault. Thurgood Marshall said, "We cannot play ostrich. Democracy just cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amid rage. America must get to work. In the chill climate in which we live, we must go against the prevailing wind. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, the mistrust. We must dissent from a nation that's buried its head in the sand, waiting in vain for the needs of its poor, its elderly, its sick to disappear and just blow away. We must dissent from a government that has left us young without jobs, education, or hope. We must dissent from the poverty of vision and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better, and America has no choice but to do better."
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. Mr. Vargas?
Commissioners, distinguished panelists, and guests, I'm pleased to have this opportunity to testify on a topic that is both timely and
I think
urgent.
your microphone was off. There you go. Now you.
Nowhere can a discussion of police practices and prosecution of police for unjustified use of deadly force have more relevance than in my hometown of Pasco, Washington. Now, Pasco is located on the historical Lewis and Clark Trail, right at the confluence of 2 great rivers, and clean, the Columbia and the Snake. It is a small little town in southeastern Washington that evolved from a railroad depot to a thriving agricultural center that it is today. Population of Hispanics there have grown considerably. Our city counts with a population of 68,000. 65% of these are Latinos. Since the 40s and 50s, Hispanics have been attracted to this great and wonderful part of the country by the wonderful opportunities in agriculture. It is a place where families, including my own, have found opportunities to find and attain a piece of the American dream. Now, we have also a cultural divide there. Language and racial diversity are not always appreciated or understood, and sometimes not accepted. For decades, my hometown, which is right across from the Hanford nuclear reactor site, was a place where minorities were dumped, if we can use that term. Blacks and Latinos were largely told to reside only in Pasco, even though they worked 40 miles away at the Hanford nuclear site, building the Hanford B reactor site. They couldn't live in the neighboring towns of Kennewick and Richland. That was reserved for the Anglo populations only. There's a recent article written by historian Kate Brown, which documents this fairly well. We remain largely disenfranchised and underrepresented in the city and the county organs of power, including the city council, county commission, school board, and yes, the Pasco City Police Department. So it's against this background that a young Hispanic by the name of Antonio Zambrano Montes was killed by members of the Pasco Police Force at approximately 5 p.m. on Tuesday, the 10th of February. Mr. Zambrano, also one of the persons who had mental disabilities, mentioned by Ms. Lewis earlier, was observed throwing rocks at the intersection of 10th and Lewis. Police were called, they responded, they came and sought to confront, and they did confront Mr. Zambrano. They issued orders to him in English, which was not his native language. Since they couldn't communicate with him, they started firing tasers at him. He started running across because, you know, tasers do hurt when you get hit. He started fleeing, and as he fled, the police drew their pistols and fired at him. One volley as he ran across the street. He gets to the other side of the street, turns left. The police are only like 30 yards behind him. They fire at Mr. Zambrano. At that point, he's weakened. He turns, lifts his hands up in the air, and the second volley hits him. In all, 17 shots were fired. Between 6 and 8 impacted on him. Now, all this was caught graphically in the cell phone camera videos, which were posted on YouTube. So from the comforts of your living room, people around the world were able to see this homicide committed by members of the Pasco Police Force. The cell phone videos make clear that Mr. Zambrano posed no threat to anyone, much less the police. His death at the hands of the police was totally unnecessary. It did not appear that the police officers even sought or thought to think of getting an interpreter to help defuse the situation, to communicate with Mr. Zambrano. When they couldn't communicate with him in English, they thought it convenient to just pull their weapons out and fire on him. And we've had previous instances of police abuse. There was one of the officers, Ryan Flanagan is his name, was accused of racial profiling in 2009 for pressing the face of a young Hispanic woman onto the hood of a hot car, causing burns to her face. She filed a complaint. It led to litigation, and she was ultimately awarded $100,000. We have an investigation process going on where police officers are investigating police officers, and we have, as Mr. Cladney pointed out, a situation where police investigating police, it's not credible. You add to that a prosecutor who has been tied with the investigation from day one, and you see the makings of a perfect storm. We will not get an impartial and objective determination on whether charges will be filed against them, against the three. There's an inherent conflict of interest. We've sought to get the prosecutor relieved or have him step aside, but that has been rejected by the prosecutor. Now, it's interesting that the police officers in question were never interviewed right after the incident, right? So all the testimony of all the other witnesses is being taken. The police officers conveniently at the end of all of this will have a chance to offer their testimony, their take on what actually happened. In no time in my 33 years of national security work for this great country have I ever been in a situation where people involved in a confrontation were not debriefed right after a confrontation such as this. This, I submit to you, poisons the credibility of the investigation. This also is in stark contrast with what happened in North Charleston, South Carolina, where a police officer there who shot an African American today sits in jail and has formal murder charges filed against him. Unlike the 3 police officers in my hometown who are free, walking the streets, and on paid administrative leave. Now, the police chief in North Charleston also said he was sickened by what he saw in the video. Don't expect that to hear from Police Chief Bob Metzger, who sits behind me, because he's been more worried about managing the press fallout and supporting his officers than he is in recognizing what had happened in our hometown. So what can we learn? We believe that there's elements of a strategy that we ought to be pursuing. First, we need a top-down review of the current police practices and policies in Pasco. Without this, we cannot get anywhere. We need to leverage the supportive services offered by the Department of Justice, the state of Washington, and governmental, non-governmental organizations, academics, community leaders to help us find a solution. We need a police oversight commission because our public rightly demands that it have some eyes on the police. We cannot expect the trust in the police to be restored if we don't have some visibility to how the police culture unfolds. We need training. Now, Police Chief Metzger here will tell you that our police officers get 130 hours of training, but he cannot tell you that this is effectively monitored or to ensure compliance. We need a highly trained police officer corps, which we probably don't have. We need justice for this, and we need to learn from this and move on and fix deficiencies which have been long-standing. I thank you for inviting me to share these thoughts with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Fogg?
Thank you very much. My name is Matthew Fogg. I'm a retired Chief Deputy United States Marshal. I was simply, in talking about this subject, I'm a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which advocates for the ending of drug prohibition, much like America ended alcohol prohibition. We believe the war on drugs in America has been the single most racist national policy that has created cultures of indifferent, extreme violence, law enforcement, racial enforcement disparities in black and brown communities, nearly having the same impact as slavery. 40 years ago, before the war on drugs began, America had 300,000 people locked up in its institutions. Today, America has 2.3 million people locked up in its institutions, 7 million on probation and parole. 1 out of 3 individuals of color from the ages of 18 to 30 are in the criminal justice system, either on probation, parole, or incarcerated. The Equal and Justice Institution also is a project that did a survey, and they found out that 50% of all men of color in major urban cities such as Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, Washington, D.C. are incarcerated or on some form of the criminal justice system. Ladies and gentlemen, I testify here because of the fact of what happened to me and what I observed in law enforcement that simply just translates from the inside to the outside. I took on the Justice Department for race discrimination, won a major lawsuit in 1998 that found the entire U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. Marshal Service to be a racial hostile environment for all of its African-American deputy U.S. Marshals. That lawsuit is still pending today, even though I won my personal lawsuit. That means right now when we talk about law enforcement, we talk about the various issues. How do we deal with lethal force? How do we deal with the disparities? What we see is we've got institutions that are already infected on the inside. I was told, Fall, go along to get along. Don't take on the system. Don't blow the whistle. Don't speak out. My partners were told the same thing. The New York Post, matter of fact, did an article, front page, Sunday morning edition, said, bigots with badges, U.S. Department of Justice, blatant racism, right here in New York City. When we look across the board, ladies and gentlemen, we see time and time again. When I came out of the academy, first thing I always remember my supervisor telling me, he said, Fogg, I know you learned all this stuff at the academy and all of the great academic stuff. He says, but this is how we do it here. And this is what we're finding time and time again, that what we're seeing is this stuff just isn't occurring just, as they say, a few bad apples. It is a system in place. I know most officers are good. We say it all the time. But that doesn't matter whether most officers are good when you're in a command and control environment. All it takes is one leader to be out of whack, and everybody's going to follow that leader. And if he's somebody that determines that whether or not we can turn our head, don't report wrongdoing, we see other officers beaten or firing. We had certain codes of conduct that we used. And I can tell you those codes of conduct behind the blue wall of silence. And I listed a couple of them because I was thinking here. I remember it says, always have a second throwdown weapon. just in case you get into a shooting, that it was illegal. When involved in shooting, it says be prepared to always articulate that you felt like your life was in danger or threatened, even if it wasn't. Just be prepared to do that. This is real behind the blue wall sign. If a suspect runs, they will get a beat down no matter what. We're going to give you a beat down. That's automatic. Get the arrest numbers up on the weakest links. Don't worry about it. I remember working DEA project, and they asked me, they said, well, Fogg, I said, listen, we're going to make this an equal opportunity enforcement operation. I was a group supervisor in charge. Said we're going into all areas to make arrests. My white supervisor, special agent in charge, pulled me off the side. He said, Fogg, I know they're doing drugs and probably doing the best stuff over there. Got the purest drugs in the white affluent neighborhoods. But if we go in there and start locking them people up, he says, let me tell you what's going to happen. He says, we're going to get scrutinized. We're going to get a phone call. They're going to shut our operation down. There goes your overtime. There go all your seizures and everything. He said, man, just go to the weakest link. What we have then is what we've got now, this ethnic cleansing. We're seeing over and over again in law enforcement, all of these things that are coming out. We see the DOJ recently did a report in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, showing the widespread racial disparities. These disparities aren't just happening overnight. Other officers, we knew we couldn't go into those affluent neighborhoods. I knew if I stopped the car with 4 whites in it and 4 blacks in it, whatever I said those black folks did, that institution was going to back me up from my supervisor all the way up to the judge. Those white folks, somebody might say to me, Fogg, what was your probable cause for stopping them? You never asked me that before. This is the type of institution that I begin to see internally that we were working with. So when I went all the way and got a finding against the U.S. Department of Justice, because I had an opportunity to settle, people said, take the money and run, man. You can't win against the Justice Department. But I went all the way and won, and that just said, it sent the message to the Department of Justice. This is real, ladies and gentlemen. So if it's happening to me, if I got to be concerned about working next to a bigot with a badge, somebody that I know is going to harm me, imagine what they're going to do to the public. So when we come up with solutions and we come up with ideas, how do we combat this problem? First thing we have to do is give police officers whistleblower protection. You're not going to get anything done if you don't have a program just like the U.S. Marshals set up, that we have set up for witness protection for people that come forward and tell the government, tell on others. You got to have that. You got to have civilian review boards with power in them. They cannot be boards that go back with no power. They got to have subpoena power, and they got to be separate and apart from law enforcement. Law enforcement cannot police themselves. It scares me today that I got to stand here and I got to say to most people of color, you cannot trust law enforcement in America today. That pains me. But when I look at what the FBI just came out with, indicating that hundreds of people were put to death, even on death row, because of forensic science that what's the word I want to say? Forensic science was tailored and corrupted. Again, when we talk about the whole institution, we're talking about from Ferguson all the way around to Philadelphia. We're talking about these issues are internal issues that need to be addressed. We got to have video, body cameras, all of these things are important. As much transparency as there can be, there has to be in law enforcement. So I say to this committee, if you're going to make an impact, that's the first thing you have to do is give law enforcement people witness protection and have these body cameras and have civilian review boards, have separate entities that make certain that law enforcement will always have oversight on top of oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fogg. Mr. Smoot, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, my name is Sean Smoot. I'm the Director and Chief Counsel for the Police Benevolent and Protective Association of Illinois. I'd like to thank the Commission for giving me the honor of speaking to you today. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to lend a voice to the rank and file officer and organizations that represent rank and file officers, and appreciate the opening comments of Commissioner Gladney and Chairman Castro to the start of this briefing. I've spent the last 20 years of my life representing the interests of rank and file police officers in every imaginable legal, legislative, and executive forum at the national, state, and local level. I verily believe that, with very few exceptions, police officers are remarkably good people who voluntarily face extraordinary challenges in their daily duties. These dedicated men and women take an oath, and they make a promise. They promise to serve and protect. This promise is universal. It is the same oath, the same promise, made and kept every day in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and in your hometowns. Whether it's in response to a terrorist attack, a tornado, a felony, or a flood, police officers run towards danger as others run away. They take the promise seriously and they put their lives on the line in order to keep it in many cases. Some of them are catastrophically injured, some of them die. It's their service and sacrifice that we will memorialize next month in Washington, D.C., at the National Police Memorial. It's this service and sacrifice that makes everything we do in America possible. We're free because others took an oath, promising to be there when we need them, to pull us from a burning car or out of the rubble, to pursue those who would commit crimes against us, to protect our lives. Nowhere has that been exemplified more powerfully or poignantly than here in New York City. I wish that I could come before you today proclaiming that police use of deadly force can be eliminated, that by implementing a specific type of training, tool, or technique, we can eliminate tragic events, the type that open new wounds or reopen old wounds, the type that plague our communities and our country currently. Sadly, confrontations resulting in police use of deadly force can't be eliminated. Some people, whether acting out of delusion, drugs, or purely evil intent, pose a lethal threat to others. This point was exemplified in the recent ABC News series In an Instant, which revealed to the nation in significant detail just 1 week ago an event involving Jacksonville, Florida police officer Pete Soulis, who killed an armed offender after being shot 5 times himself. This episode illustrates how quickly a seemingly calm and routine police shift can turn into a deadly, violent interaction. Now, that is not to say that all uses of deadly force are legally or morally justified. Police officers, like the rest of us, are imperfect human beings. There are over 18,000 police agencies across the United States and nearly 1 million police officers. Let me say this loud and clear. Those who choose to abuse their power and authority stain the service of the entire law enforcement community, and they must be held accountable. Furthermore, credible representation of police officers requires the unconditional condemnation of those few who abuse the authority that so many officers exercise dutifully and responsibly under the law. Deadly encounters, while they cannot be eliminated, can be reduced. The interim report of President Obama's task force on policing in the 21st century identified in several recommendations and action items which, if adopted properly, can greatly reduce police use of deadly force. As you may know, I was appointed to serve as a member of the task force by the President on December 18, 2014. In less than 90 days, the task force held 7 public listening sessions across the country, heard the testimony of over 120 live witnesses, and received thousands of pages of written testimony and other documents. This report is the process of a consensus deliberation. I understand that the Commission has a full day of testimony scheduled, and I suspect you're anxious to engage me and other members of the panel with questions and comments. So I would just direct your attention to the recommendations and action items that I've submitted in my written submission, have highlighted to you from the President's report. I trust you've been provided a copy of the report, and if you have not, I've provided you in my submission the internet site where you and others can get a full copy of it. I hope that you will read the whole thing, and I hope that the Commission will embrace the entire report. I also hope that you will remember that police officers are the tip of the spear for a very troubled criminal justice system. I want to point out just one thing because it's come up in multiple pieces of the testimony this morning, and that is the effective developments I think potentially very effective technological development of body-worn cameras, which I've outlined in some detail in my written submission to you. I've long been an advocate for their use, and I believe that proper implementation of those will go a long way towards reducing violent interactions between police and the communities they serve, and this is borne out by some very interesting science. We can do more, though, than just employ body cameras. I think we can do a lot more in terms of employing technology to create better real-life simulation training, which should be expanded beyond the use of force and into training areas related to cultural competency, crisis intervention, implicit bias, and recognizing disabilities. Police organizations can play an important role in reducing violent interactions by expanding their work in community outreach like police athletic leagues, and by helping to educate members of the public about what their members do, how they do it, and why. More training and more community involvement are the key to building trust and ultimately reducing violence. In closing, I would like to again thank the Commission for your kind invitation today. I realize that I and others provided you with a good deal of information to consider, and I sincerely hope that the work of the President's Task Force and hearing my perspective of that work will assist you in advising the President and Congress in the future. I would also like to thank you and your staff for your time and for your service in promoting liberty and justice for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. Before I begin to invite questions from commissioners, I want to just, for the record, indicate that that Commissioner Harriet joined us, so you can make sure that's in the transcript of the hearing. And also, for my fellow commissioners, we just received official confirmation from our Office of the General Counsel that our notational vote to confirm President Obama's nomination of Mauro Morales as our staff director passed unanimously. Commissioner Cladden, you want to take the first question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smoot, the other witnesses called for independent investigations. Today, most use of force investigations are done by sister agencies. You know, the city next door, the state police, whatever. Do you believe? Recently, actually the other day in Baltimore, I heard on the news this morning a young man died, right. And the mayor is allowing a parallel investigation between sister police forces doing an investigation, and we have independent investigations. There are companies that do it, things like that. Do you think it's an inherent conflict to have sister police forces investigate other police agencies because they work on task force together, the chiefs work together, they work on investigations together, their DNA is kind of like all mixed together?
I don't. In the context that we do it in the state where I'm from, in Illinois, almost all police shootings or uses of deadly force outside the city of Chicago are investigated by either the Illinois State Police, which has a segregated public integrity unit that does those investigations, or by a multi-jurisdictional major crimes unit. And in those, within those multi-jurisdictional major crime units, if there even are officers who are assigned to those units from the agency where the incident occurred, those officers are not allowed to participate or speak to the officers who are doing the investigation. In fact, I think there's a couple issues with regard to having private companies do these investigations. One, I think there's an analogy that could be made in terms of privatizing corrections, which I think is a very dangerous thing to do. And I think whenever we put a profit motive on a function of government, perhaps we come up with results that are driven by profits and not by actually getting to the truth. And the second thing, which is something that was identified in the President's Task Force report, is the importance of having police officers conduct these investigations who have had exposure to the same types of use of force training and understand how these situations can unfold and what realistic reactions would be to them.
I might be able to agree with you if I lived in a state like Illinois. I don't. I live in a small state. One police department investigates the other police department. They all pretty much know each other. They hang out in the same bars, things like that. So I think a large state perhaps can isolate somebody. My second question has to do with the 48-hour rule. What do you think of that? Where, like Colonel Vargas was talking about, where in a lot of contracts, police contracts, where a person involved in a use of force complaint doesn't have to make a statement for 48 hours, can consult with their lawyer, do this, do that, see all the evidence, and then make a statement. The reason I ask that is because all other civil servants have to make a statement right away. Why not police officers? Why is it negotiated into a contract?
I believe it's negotiated into contracts for various reasons. One, the science behind how people remember things, particularly those that are involved in a high-stress, adrenaline-infused situation, has shown that memories can often be inaccurate if they are immediate. Because, for instance, if a police officer has a firearm pointed at them, the research shows and the science shows that they get what is commonly referred to as tunnel vision. And while they may be focused on the barrel of the gun, their brain continues to process other things that occur away from that focal point. But those things will not come back to them, that processing will not come back to them until their brain catches up after the incident. Some departments where there is no contractual requirement, the investigating agencies often require that officers have at least 2 sleep cycles before they interview them for their investigation, because they want to get the most accurate information that they can from the officer in terms of what they saw, what they perceived, and what their physical reactions.
So it's your belief that the officers should be able to review the evidence, talk to fellow officers, see what they found before they make a statement?
I can't say they should be able to review all of the evidence. Should they be able to talk to other officers who were directly working with them? Yes, I don't think that there's a problem with that in terms of not to formulate or create testimony, but in terms of, I thought that he was over here. Is that where you were? After the fact. But initially, normally officers are sequestered from other officers. In my state, it's fairly typical to have contract language that would either require under the law or under the contract that an officer be provided immediate medical attention if they need it, and then that they would only be speaking to a mental health professional, a clergy person, their spouse.
And their lawyer.
Or their lawyer, of course.
Right, okay. I got just one more area I want to cover because I know other people have questions.
Certainly.
You talked in your statement, I believe, about non-punitive investigations.
Yes,
did you
I
talk
did.
about that? You weren't, there didn't seem to be some clarity about whether those were privileged or, because you made mention about medical and aviation.
Yes.
The problems that I've heard about debriefs is that they're not done, that the rank and file don't really get anything, the investigations are never made public, and all that. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that they should be public and privileged, private and privileged, or do you believe that they should be disseminated through the police department, or should they be made public? What exactly is your thoughts on that?
I think in large part it might depend on what the exposure to liability would be, and that wouldn't necessarily just be liability for the officer, but liability for the agency. But I think that they should be done. And they should be totally separate and apart from other types of investigations which ultimately are made public. So, for instance, they should be totally separate and apart, of course, of any criminal type of investigation into the officer's conduct, and they should be separated from the internal affairs or internal review process of the department. The reason that I think it's essential that we do them, and what we're referring to is what is commonly called sentinel event reviews, is because there is a great deal of information that could be learned from that type of a review, that type of an open, honest review, between the officers who were involved and other parties who were involved in the incident, that could prevent future uses of deadly force or future uses of force. And I think we really miss a lot by not learning from those events. And we have a very good guidepost in terms of medicine where the federal government has actually created a safe place, a set of laws which is cited to in my written submission, so that those who work in the medical field can learn from their mistakes quickly, relatively, after they're made, so that we don't have surgeries that where an error is made. Somebody doesn't mark the right part of the body to be operated on, or people notice that a sponge is missing when they finish closing up a patient. These are the types of I use those as examples, but obviously there are a lot of things that I think we might miss from an analysis when the analysis is strictly an adversarial one. The investigation is strictly an adversarial one.
Commissioner, I'm going to move on now. We have Commissioner Achtenberg, followed by Commissioner Yaki, myself, the Vice Chair, and then Commissioner Harriet. Commissioner Achtenberg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Simmons, I was struck by first of all, your testimony in its entirety, very impressive, but in particular, two elements that you cite. One element of your quality policing initiative recommendations related to the old-fashioned residency requirements. I say old-fashioned, I think they're out of vogue now, but once were quite prevalent. I'm interested in having you articulate in greater detail why a residency requirement helps, and if you could also discuss with us jurisdictions that have such a requirement, how it's worked, and is there scientific information that backs up the notion that better policing gets done if the police reside in the communities that they're protecting. And then the second issue would be the recommendation that you make for civilian review of the what comes out of the dashboard camera recommendation. How is that material to be handled, and why do you recommend civilian custody of that material? So if you could address those two issues, I'd be very appreciative.
Okay. First, with regard to actually the residency requirement,
Yes.
I do not have scientific data on hand. For a long time, within our region, we did hold residency requirements.
Yes.
For both police service, fire service. Now, what we've actually seen in case of Ferguson and Point is that the vast amount of officers who populate those positions tend to actually live external to the actual region. In many cases, whereas St. Louis is divided primarily with St. Louis City proper and St. Louis County, when we talk about the field of populations I referred to within northern St. Louis County, the vast majority of those officers don't live anywhere inside that footprint. They actually live external in West County. And in our area, we have to be very honest and clear about the way the population works. We are one of the most segregated areas of the country. What that means is that you have people who don't live in the place and don't usually have direct relationship to citizens, and that also undermines the idea of actually being able to hold folks accountable. People feel more or less under occupation with the way that it currently exists. There was a time in which there was at least a minimum of like a 2-year requirement in place. That at minimum would involve some increased level of trust. I mean, ideally what we'd like to see is a system that creates officers that are first and foremost held accountable to what they're trained to do, but then secondly, held accountable by the way they're actually relating and interacting with the communities in which they're being charged with policing, which means that you can't enter a community and then not be in relationship with folks. Right now, what usually happens is officers are deployed in the communities in which they don't have relations. They have no charge to build relations, which means when they're being deployed, they're actually deployed. Usually it's actually being driven right now by science, meaning that they're using policing tactics that say that we expect crime to happen in these locations, versus actually being in relationship with people who live there and can tell you exactly what's going on. We're trying to shift that paradigm in regard to the residency requirements.
And are you aware of jurisdictions that do hold a residency requirement?
Locally, no, not anymore, which is one reason we're actually looking at it back. But I think part of what we're working on with the next version of the document is to bulk up and actually provide more case studies on things like this. In regard to civilian oversight, and you specifically referred to like the media accountability system.
Yes.
And that's been the charge of a great amount of debate, even locally, because we've learned, especially even over the course of the last year, that even with video, there are many cases in which you won't necessarily get the level of justice that you want.
Sure.
The language we use is actually making certain that each and every facet of the reforms and the transformation we're talking about includes layers of civilian accountability. With this, honestly, we've actually, in the next version, you're going to see stricter language about how the data is used, because there's also concerns that what is captured by the cameras could actually be used not only to protect citizens, but also to violate citizens' rights. So we're very, very concerned about how the data is going to be used. On one hand, we definitely want to see it used to both protect both the officers and the people they're policing in terms of giving an account of what actually took place. But what we don't want to see happen is that officers walk up into a place just because they have their camera on and unwittingly violate someone's First and Fourth Amendment rights because they're actually recording data. So in the next version, you're going to see a lot more strict language. But with the Civilian Accountability Project, we actually believe that there has to be some level of citizen interaction, accountability, and a role in which at each and every facet, whether we're talking about in basic training or in their advancement, or in the systems of accountability, where a civilian review board or some layer of a civilian accountability system has to come into play. That's only going to foster greater accountability and transparency within our communities.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Commissioner Yaki?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I also want to thank Commissioner Clanny for his leadership in pulling together this hearing today. Brief question first to Mr. Smoot, then I want to ask Mr. Simmons and some of the other panelists a different question. I just wanted to follow up really quickly on your statement regarding the 48-hour rule that are in collective bargaining agreements with police officers. If you would show me what the data says about the 48 hours, that would be really important, because it just strikes me that there's an asymmetry between what we hear often about the police saying they need to get first impressions from witnesses right away at the statement or from a suspect or what have you, but then we're asking another set of recipient witnesses simply by virtue of their contract to be able to reflect for 48 hours, and somehow there's an asymmetry of accuracy there that I'm not quite sure I understand.
So if I could address your comment, I would first of all encourage you to look. There's Dr. Lewinsky, who testified before the President's task force, heads the Force Science Institute.
Right.
And they have done a tremendous amount of research, which is widely available on their organization's website. And I'm sure that Dr. Lewinsky would be happy to provide the Commission with a lot of scientific data with regard to that question. To your second point, there's a significant difference between a criminal suspect who is given their Miranda rights and has no obligation to answer any questions or provide any information, and a public employee who, under Garrity, can be forced under threat of job forfeiture to answer questions and provide information. And so I think there is a somewhat of a misunderstanding that these waiting period rules are the result of a collective bargaining agreement, and in some states they may be. They are also statutory in many states, and recommended by organizations like the IACP. Right. As part of the best practices, because ultimately, when that police officer makes their report,
Right.
They are making the report of what ultimately could be an expert witness in court.
Sure. No, I understand. But it's, to me, it's not just a suspect. It's also, I mean, I'm a lawyer. Half of us, more than half, I think all of us on this panel, almost all are lawyers. We know how we would use a witness's first statement versus their recollection a day later as impeachment for what. It's just a comment. I just wanted to get the science. But the question I wanted to address to Mr. Pasco and Mr. Simmons and Mr. Fogg has to do with a different aspect of.
Right?
I'm sorry.
Mr. Vargas.
Vargas. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's quite all right.
What happens when you take off your glasses? You have a situation. I asked this because the flip side of residency is that I come from both Commissioner Ackerman and I come from a city where it's almost impossible for anyone to actually live there because it's so expensive, much less anyone on a public servant salary. However, if you were to, I believe that if you were to have strong affirmative action requirements, that in which the police force were to reflect the population. Well, we all know that a lot of these populations live in those areas, and can be recruited from these areas. And I would like your thoughts about how a strong affirmative action policy can help better create a better community policing climate and try and reduce the level of whatever you want to call it, mistakes, error, intent, bad judgment, bad policing that goes on right now.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Yaki. I do believe that an affirmative action program can significantly increase understanding, certainly linguistic competency, which will help community policing and build confidence within the community. We don't have that in my hometown of Pasco. We have roughly 14 officers of 72 who are Hispanic, and not all of those are fluent Spanish speakers. Some have varying degrees because they're third and fourth generation Hispanics. We're dealing with a community where 65% of the community is Hispanic. Significantly over 40% are first generation. So English is almost the second language spoken in Pasco. You need to have affirmative actions programs where you have police officers who are culturally sensitive and are able to communicate with the community to make a difference. We have been pushing this. We have in a meeting we had on the 27th of January with the police chief, pushed him to consider a better selection program so that you bring in more Hispanics, and we got the reasons why that wasn't happening. The standards were apparently too high to find qualified Hispanics to be selected. We continue to believe that really that is a must. You fire your human resources officer. You get someone who can identify and find where these good candidates are. You bring them in, because without an affirmative action program, we're not going to get anywhere.
And I guess I need to be clear in that the residency requirement we're talking about includes affirmative action, but it's also part of systemic transformation of the institution. Right now, we have real, tangible problems of recruiting folks into policing because of their view of policing and policing culture. The police right now within our communities are very much out of relationship. They are not, they're really viewed as outsiders, they're viewed as hostile forces, they're viewed as occupying forces. Our contingency is that as we begin to transform the institution, it must reflect new gender and racial parity, so that folks will actually be in communication, be in direct relationship with these folks. But in the way it currently exists, honestly, you'd be bringing in people to be acculturated to just become another hostile force.
Right.
And that's been the tendency. Definitely throughout my lifetime, that's been the tendency. We're hoping for a more systemic shift.
You know, and follow up on that, Commissioner. I was thinking about an incident in D.C. The D.C. Superior Court with U.S. Marshals was predominantly African-American, predominantly black, our force was. And what I saw was from the top down that we didn't get the same sort of replies to our complaints of we didn't have proper equipment we're working with, everything that we're working with. So a lot of officers sort of became disgruntled. We were overworked by the prisoner load that was coming in, everything that we was dealing with. Suddenly they came along, and all of the complaints that we made, nobody paid attention to us until they started bringing in white deputy marshals. When they brought in all of the whites, all of a sudden they began to give them office space, everything changed. What we see over and over again is race plays a very important role here. It seems that when you do bring in, even if you bring in black officers, a lot of times you might not even get the best qualified, but they said, we're just going to, affirmative action, we're just going to throw officers at you. The problem is, once we start making certain that everything is done fairly and equally, no matter who you are, black or white, if you're going to apply laws, they got to be applied fairly. When I look at Ferguson, I just think one thing, I'd say, here you had a prosecutor that treated an officer totally different from then what he treated all the other suspects before the grand jury. So what you get is these sort of disparities in how we operate, and that's what I think the real problem is. Even if you were to bring in black cops, certainly you want people there that can identify with the community, but you also have to make certain that there's oversight, that they're trained.
Great.
They're not just put there because somebody said it's affirmative action, let's throw them there.
Thank you. And Mr. Vargas, I apologize for the Pasco reference, but I just want you to know, when you were testifying, I went and watched the video on my screen of the shooting, and it's appalling. It is absolutely appalling.
Thank you, Commissioner Yaki. I've got questions for three of the panelists, so I'll try to be brief. The first is for Mr. Vargas. Now, in Pasco, do you have, I mean, is this Zambrano case an aberration, or have you seen other similar interactions with police and the Latino community in Pasco?
There is a history of cultural misunderstanding, shall we say, and a history of misunderstandings between our police and the Hispanic community. That misunderstanding, however, in the past has not led to violent confrontations for the most part. If you go to Pasco, you'll find any number of folks who will come forward and give you their own historical perspective on police abuse, misbehavior within our community. But as far as police-involved shootings, the Zambrano case stands out on its own. We haven't had this level of violence against the Hispanic community by the police force up until the Zambrano case.
And in many communities where there are large Latino populations, and it's been my personal experience that there already tends to be a concern in terms of the interaction between the Latino community in the police for a number of reasons, including immigration status. What has been the condition or the change in conditions between the relationship between the Latino population in Pasco and the Latino community and the police department since Zambrano?
There is widespread concern that you cannot trust the police now, and many in our community, in the Hispanic community, are fearing fear of the police institution. I'm very concerned about that because I share the view echoed earlier that anyone who wears the uniform has a very demanding job, and for the most part, people who do are very, very respectful. But what we have in Pasco is great uncertainty, great apprehension now, and this case of Zambrano is being watched very carefully. If the police officers are exonerated, I want to be very clear, if they're exonerated, if the charges are not filed against them, based on the irrefutable evidence of multiple videos taken of the homicide, it will not be understood. We have a daily protest movement going on in the city, and I fear greatly that we will enter another phase of protest if these officers walk. So there's, again, I come back to the apprehension, widespread concern in the Hispanic community that the police just are not to be trusted.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Fogg, you talked about in terms of the diversification of the police force. I think it's a complex issue. I think some assume that if you have an officer of color, that necessarily is going to improve matters. Now, I know from personal experience, I had a young brother many years ago, was 16 years old, just got his driver's permit and was driving his beater that my dad had just bought him through the park to get comfortable, and there was a small crack in the windshield. Nonetheless, the police officer pulled him over, threw him on the hood, cuffed him, took him to jail, and left the car there. When he found out it was my dad's son, he said, "Oh, Ray, I'm sorry you knew my dad. If I known it was your son, I wouldn't have done it." Well, this was a Latino police officer doing this to a Latino young person. So sometimes in the community, there is a greater fear of police officers from your own community. Could you talk a little bit about that nuance and how that interplays into the larger picture of what we're talking about today?
Certainly, Commissioner. The thing with that, I believe, is, as we say, we used to always have a little joke saying we're all on the plantation, sort of, meaning the paradigm of where we're working. And from the top up, really from the top down, when we talk about how we are to do our policing, if somebody's saying get your numbers up, you gotta get your numbers up. We gotta see how many summonses you're writing, or how many people you're locking up for the month. All of the things that they ask us to do, and then they say, now, don't go in those other communities and make this an equal enforcement opportunity operation. Just concentrate your resources on those urban areas. Then you're going to have, I don't care if you're black or white, you're going to be in there trying to do your job. So you're going to be going after people. And what happens is that puts this sort of strain on the black officer, because the black community, or I'm sure in the Hispanic community, they look at him as he's the sellout. He's coming over here locking us up, because the community knows we're not doing equal enforcement opportunity. They know we're not going and locking up others and making this thing fair and just. So they know that they're being the target. So that's what the officer is dealing with. He's dealing with this sort of paradigm that he's pushed into this sort of box that creates this problem. So what we have to do here is we have to make certain that, I always said it all along, if the war on drugs was an equal opportunity enforcement operation where we was doing it over in the affluent areas, it would have fixed itself a long time ago. All of these problems that we're talking about today, excessive force and everything, they would automatically fix themselves once we begin to see that we're going to make certain that if we're going to go into houses, throw flashbangs in, we're going to go after you for drugs, we're going into wherever we know they are, then you would have a contingency of the community coming together saying, people saying, we need to look at this again. We need to change it. But what happens the way it is now, no, they give you a badge and a gun. They tell that black officer, you stay to this particular area, and if you get your numbers up, we're going to promote you. And so what happens is that creates this sort of animosity with the people, and you got to change that sort of concept that officer is not just coming in here looking to just lock people up, arrest, get his numbers up because there are crimes being committed, but we're there doing community policing. I think that's one of the biggest things.
Thank you. Mr. Smoot, fellow Illinoisan, Chicago is a different place than the rest of the state. And, I've had the honor of working with and have many friends that are Chicago police officers who are doing very difficult jobs, and I respect that. And had the opportunity recently to meet, as you said, when folks run away from danger, it's our officers and first responders that are running towards it. I met Officer Brian Murphy, who was one of the first responders at the Oak Creek Sikh Temple, and heard from him personally what he went through in order to save lives. So I'm very cognizant of that. And when I ran for Congress a decade and a half ago, the only union to endorse me was the Fraternal Order of Police because of the work we did together on violence prevention. So I am uniquely aware and very respectful of the work of the police. But having said that, clearly there's some issues here, or we wouldn't be here today. In one of your comments and your remarks, you said we will never eliminate the police use of deadly force. And as a concept, I can understand that. I think what we're trying to do here is figure out how we can eliminate the unjustified use of police deadly force. And when I was as an observer, I attended our Missouri State Advisory Committee hearing in St. Louis County on this issue. It was asked of some of the police officers that presented there, why can't you just shoot someone in the leg or in the arm? And the officers said, well, we are trained to shoot at the mass of the body. And I have some friends who are police officers, and I asked them the same question back home, and they said, well, our training is to eliminate the threat. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because to many of us, just common sense seems that, you can't eliminate the threat without necessarily killing the threat. Could you address that?
Well, I think, yes, I can. So I think a lot of this stems from what traditionally and unfortunately is still predominantly a use of force training paradigm that doesn't have at the front end a sanctity of life philosophy. Now, and that's just in regard to use of force. We have some pretty good tools now that are less than lethal force. And where they're deployed properly, where the officers are trained properly, they've been very effective. I can't put a number on the number of lives that have been saved because officers have used electronic devices like the taser instead of a firearm in literally thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of situations over the last 20 years. And I understand tasers have, those things are, nothing is perfect, but if you have a choice between being shot with a taser and a firearm, I would recommend the taser as a personal recommendation. In terms of when the officer doesn't have access to that tool, and many don't, many in the city of Chicago don't. When Chicago implemented a taser program, only the sergeants were initially issued tasers, and then that was some specialty units were added to the category of people that could have the less than lethal technology. So every officer doesn't have that option. We are trained, and we do train officers to stop the threat. And if you're at the point in the use of force continuum where it is deadly force, the training is center mass. Now, the training used to be 2 to the body, 1 to the head. I'd say maybe that we go to center mass now could be considered progress. But realistically, if you use firearms and are familiar with particularly using a handgun, you would realize very quickly in a short period of time on the range, even with a great deal of practice, it would be very difficult to just shoot someone in the arm or the leg. And in fact, part of the reason that the training is now center mass is because, as I'm sure you know, the laws of physics apply. And when a round leaves a weapon, if it doesn't hit its intended target, it doesn't then stop. It will continue to travel and perhaps hit an unintended person or target. And that is also a consideration, I think, that was put into place with the training methodology.
Well, I'm glad that the training is no longer to just blow my brains out, but nonetheless, we saw in Pasco, 17 shots, 5 or 6 actually hit, maybe 8, I forget the number. Where'd those other 9 go? So even with the shooting at the mass, there's some issues there, and I would hope that we could figure out a way to better train our police officers to become better marksmen and women, so that maybe they don't have to shoot the center mass. I've got to believe that that's a possibility.
If I could just expound for a
and
moment,
Mr.
because
Fogg after Mr. Smoot.
Because I think you've hit on a very important point. Even in the most progressive police training states, the standard for training is annual qualification, which means under most standards, 40 rounds fired at a target, a paper target, and if you hit within the 10 square, 30 of the 40 rounds, in some cases, as low as 30, you qualify. That's it. Well, anybody who has worked in law enforcement knows, first of all, that's totally unrealistic training. We don't shoot at stationary objects. We certainly don't shoot at stationary full frontal objects. And without some simulation, without some realistic shoot, don't shoot scenarios, even if you meet the training if you have met the training qualifications of qualifying once annually, I would argue you're not really well prepared to deploy your firearm in a high-stress, highly volatile, fast-action scenario. And that's the kind of training that we need to ensure is mandatory for officers on more than an annual basis.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. Mr. Fogg, and then I'm going to give it to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Castro. One of the things, I was a member of the SWAT team, and I've been involved in the shooting. And I remember it was a shooting in Miami, and we were fighting. I was fighting this guy, and I had my weapon on me. And this was a fugitive, escaped felon. We're fighting in this apartment, all over the apartment. My partner had a sawed-off shotgun. And I never pulled my weapon out, even though I was fighting him. I'm physically fighting. Now, our training teaches us, because I'm not supposed to really be fighting you, because you might get a lick on me, punch me and knock me dizzy, take my gun and shoot me. So there's a lot of discretion. The problem that I've got here in law enforcement today, when I see these incidents all over the country, and we got video now, we're looking at these things, and we've had a lot of training. I had sort of what Mr. Smoot was talking about, where our training involved being on the SWAT team, where we were using rubber bullets shooting at each other. We had our mass urges, so it was really, you had a lot of high stress in shooting situations. The U.S. attorney asked me right after we ultimately shot the guy. I didn't shoot him. They shot him with a shotgun. Accidentally, the shotgun went off while the guy was running. My partner fell down. Boom. We didn't kill him. And one of the pellets hit somebody at the end of the hallway. Didn't kill her. It just went through her lip, and it wasn't nothing deadly there. But the key was Assistant U.S. Attorney, the first thing he asked me, and we gave statements right away, and he said, Mr. Fogg, I got to identify you, he said, because I need to know what happened. He said, after I told him everything, I was fighting this guy, he says, I got one question for you. He said, why didn't you just pull your gun out and shoot him while you were fighting him? And I stopped, and I thought, and I said, I guess I didn't feel like my life was in danger. He said, oh, good answer, good answer. The problem what we're seeing today is why I'm seeing these incidents where I'm like, this officer didn't have to shoot. Mm-hmm. But what we're told in our training is if you do shoot, just say all the things that they're saying. I felt for my life. I was scared. I just thought somebody had just gotten killed a couple of 6 weeks ago, whatever. The point is you have to be convincing that I used deadly force when maybe I didn't have to. And then the second piece is, why is this deadly force being used often against people of color? There's more to this than just simply training. It's not. I had great training. All of the guys that I know had great training. It's our discretion. Why are these people shooting these folks who are people of color? Because there's a threat mechanism there. There's some fear there or somebody saying, I don't have to put up with this guy. you doing this to me, I can just shoot him. Like we saw that guy running away from the officer, and he just is calmly shooting at this guy down in South Carolina. Just no second thoughts at all. That's really what the problem is. It's not the training. It's what's in our mind when we're releasing these rounds. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Fogg. Madam Vice Chair?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to add my thanks to all of the others that our panelists have received. We do appreciate you taking your time and being with us. My first question deals with the fact that as a result of private citizens that are now videoing with their telephones and other instruments, we're seeing a perspective of events that have unfolded in a number of these situations that we would not have seen but for that. It's my understanding that at least one state's legislature is considering, or it has been proposed, that they make it illegal for private citizens to video police activity. First thing I want to know, any one of you think that that is a good idea?
No.
No, ma'am. Not at all. No, not a good idea.
Matter of fact, why shouldn't such legislation come about? Let's start with you, Mr. Smoot. Why?
The only reason that I could see that you would prohibit taping wouldn't necessarily be the prohibition of recording, but perhaps how it's done. So that if there were some kind of limitation on how close you could actually get to the officers when they're handling a situation or something like that. We've seen some situations that, just go online and you can see situations where officers are attempting to effect a lawful arrest, and there are citizens who take out their cell phones and are literally holding it this close to the officer while they're trying to effect an arrest. So, I was at a meeting a few days ago, and it was suggested, and I don't remember what state it was, but that there was some legislation being proposed that there be like a 30-foot requirement, which would allow citizens to exercise their right to videotape officers performing their work.
So
but
as long
also
as it could
allow
be
the
done
officers,
safely.
yes, in the interest of safety.
And the other piece is, if now everybody's seen cops, right? We've all seen the video cops. The cops are being filmed. They enjoy it, and they're going on instant calls. The radio's going, everything. So if we can do it in cops, why can't we do it across the board? That's my answer to that one.
I advise the officers that I represent, which is about 10,000 officers in the state of Illinois, they should always assume they're being recorded.
That's exactly right.
We've actually conducted Know Your Rights and Cop Watch trainings. At the heart of that is that, yes, you have a First Amendment right to go ahead and document the activity, but you must not interfere.
Yes.
Which means you must keep a safe distance. You must not interfere with the course of activity. So that's at the heart of what most of those folks are doing. Many of them, even though they may not be part of a Cop Watch team or something organized, they've actually seen or had the same training. So there's no rational idea for such a law unless you're, again, trying to create another layer of insulation for the institution.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question, and it's for everyone, but Mr. Simmons, I was particularly struck by the depth and the breadth of and the passion of your remarks, and in fact I related on a personal level to much of what it is that you shared about your early life experiences. But I want to explore the transformation of policing and your challenge to us that we reimagine policing, of the recommendations that you've made and others have proposed, and you've pointed out to us that most of the recommendations aren't new. I was wondering whether there is any one which in your mind would lead to the greatest transformation. It looks like we're having a hard time getting anything done, but if we could get one proposal through, which do you think would be lead to the most transformation?
Witness protection.
And I stand with you in witness protection, but honestly, I would go toward deployment. we'd have to start in the field of how police are actually deployed to do their jobs. Too often, they're not actually being used for direct public safety. Too often, as a result of what he mentioned before in terms of the war on drugs, they're actually deployed looking for folks instead of actually addressing actual crime. In the community I grew up with, if there was a car that was broken into or stolen, you had less opportunity to actually see any justice in that crime than you would in just seeing someone picked up randomly under suspicion of either being involved in a gang, involved in drugs, involved in any one thing. To break-ins, response to theft, those things very rarely got solved. Most of the resources of the department were actually put toward deploying officers to actually find and rake in suspects under the hope that they actually may be involved in some area of crime versus actually deploying them to respond to the crimes that were actually being reported. So I would start there, just in terms of basic functioning and thinking about safety beyond policing, which I know is actually a campaign in this city to actually realign and think about how police are being used. But I think that's absolutely right, because there's a lot of witnesses within the institution itself that could speak to what's happening, and they're afraid to because the institution tends to punish them.
Let me ask Ms. Lewis and Mr. Davis if you would respond in the context of in the disability context.
What is the top thing that we could do in the disability context for meaningful change?
Yes.
For
transformative change.
Transformative change. Well, in Maryland, we actually passed a bill this session called the Ethan Saylor Alliance for the Self-Advocates as Educators. And one of the big things in our testimony we identified is the need for relationship building. And also, the President's Task Force also identified that as a key thing that needs to happen. And so, just creating those opportunities for people with disabilities to have meaningful interaction, build meaningful relationships with law enforcement, we think is going to be one of the most important steps in meaningful transformation. And the way that the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability is looking at doing that is through our Pathways to Justice training, having people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as the trainers, creating that opportunity, not just for, we don't really see that officers need to be able to diagnose a disability, but to know about disability and to know somebody in their community who has a disability and can build that relationship is what we think will lead to the transformative changes that will have the best impact.
Ms. Lewis?
I believe that what we need to do across the board is have a bit of what we call in the disability community, disability solidarity. What that looks like is communities of color who are fighting for racial justice also need to be fighting for disability justice. And those and organizations, disability rights organizations, should also be fighting for racial justice. The intersections between those at the margins of the margins can be seen, have been spoken to here. And if those populations aren't being focused on, then I'm not sure what we are doing. So decriminalization of disability means not incarcerating people, not arresting people who are acting in ways that are commensurate to with their disability for things that can't be controlled. And I think that's first. And then talking about public safety and how we deploy police officers, and this is how it all overlaps. What we find is that people in the disability community, we now are telling people, don't call the police if your loved one is in a crisis. And that's problematic, and we see that, of course, in the black community as well, and the brown communities as well. And there's no reason for that. There should be a certain amount of trust that can be had, and right now it's not going to happen until we start talking about culture shifts and we really start looking at disability and racial issues simultaneously.
Thank you. Commissioner Harriet, and then Commissioner Narasaki will conclude this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Yaki already asked the question that I first had come up with for Mr. Smoot, but I just want to follow up very briefly. You had mentioned that a Dr. Lewinsky was the primary source for the research that you mentioned.
He's the leader in the field, yes.
Could you do the commission a favor here? If there's some literature that isn't by Dr. Lewinsky, could you supply that to us in the next week or so? Give us the citations just so we know where it is.
Certainly.
The other issue I just wanted a little bit more information on. You had mentioned that many police officers are not equipped with tasers. What's the bottleneck here? Is it because tasers are very expensive? Is it because we have to go through a period of training? Why hasn't this happened more rapidly than it has? I mean, tasers are new, but they're not that new.
I'm honestly not sure. I think it really boils down in a great deal, like everything else, to funding, because they're not that expensive to deploy. In fact, you can get some grants, and even some companies that produce these things will assist agencies in getting them. But unfortunately, when economic times become tight for state and local government, one of the very first things to get cut is police training, and before you can effectively and safely deploy these things, officers have to be trained in how to use them properly.
Mr. Fogg, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the taser. I've heard the issue about the tasers often, many times. If the officer had a taser, maybe he wouldn't use deadly force. Deadly force has a strict code, which when we use deadly force, I'm not going to pull out a taser if I think that you're trying to take my life. Mm-hmm. I'm going to pull my gun out. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason for me to use a taser if I need to shoot you. We have to see the difference between the two. The taser is more or less probably to sort of maybe subdue somebody. But when you're using deadly force and you're firing rounds off, you got to articulate, I was in extreme danger for my life, or the life, imminent danger, or the life of someone else. That's the difference. So I'm concerned with people saying...
What is it about the taser that makes you consider it inadequate?
Because I'm saying that I'm not going to use a taser if I really think you're trying to kill me.
But I'm just asking why, because I'm
yeah.
Is it less effective, you think, in
yes.
With that?
If I think you're trying to kill me, I want to make sure probably I'm going to kill you or stop you 100%, and the taser may not. And now I understand tasers should, but we've seen people have been tased and still shot or still were able to do things that we didn't think they could. I just want to be clear that when we say using a taser as opposed to your gun, if that's an option that I have, then maybe my life really isn't the type of danger that I really think it is. That's the concern that I have here.
Mr. Vargas and Mr. Simmons?
Commissioner, tasers can be effective in a variety of scenarios. However, when you have a young man who suffers from mental illness and he has substance abuse, he has drugs in him, a taser really is not going to make that much of an impact on that person, really. And that was the case with Mr. Zambrano. So then the officer's left with using a 45 caliber Glock pistol, which is a highly lethal weapon to use. The problem that we have is that we're not considering other techniques. In the case of Mr. Zambrano, he was a small man, maybe 5'6", weighed maybe 130 pounds. All you needed to do was basically just put your arms on that person, and you had him controlled. Okay. We have no training in takedown procedures for our police, which is necessary to consider.
Thank you.
I just want to follow his comment. Earlier when we were talking about training and we talk about threat progression, too often people go to deadly force out of fear in stating that they're actually in fear for their life. Unfortunately, we live in a time and in a place in which that's actually enhanced by the lens in which we see race. And skin often translate to increased threat, increased fear. So one of the things we're actually recommending is enhanced personal unarmed combat training, under the idea that if you're actually trained, if you actually feel comfortable in actually using your body in combat, you may be less inclined to default to a weapon and default to thinking that you're actually in fear for your life. It's actually training, well, one, hopefully in adding that to the culture, you begin to weed out those who will automatically, by instinct, what we normally say is typically we see two types. Either you get Boy Scouts or bullies. And in our eyes, there are those who actually want to go into this and do the right thing, want to serve the people. Those are Boy Scouts. But there are those who come in with an inclination toward violence, an inclination toward using weapons and hostility. If they're actually trained, hopefully we'll see more folks come in with the inclination to actually do the right thing.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Just real quick. I'm not sure if, as a law enforcement officer, and I've been in a lot of situations. I'm not sure if it's the train. It's not the training. It's I've decided that you are less value and I can shoot you. And I can get away with it. We have a license to kill. I know that. I just have to be able to articulate all of the things that I'm going to get my story together later and do exactly that. So that all I'm just simply saying to you is, no, we need psychological intervention before we even get on that job. And it has to be extreme psychological testing and understanding what a person's purpose is and a reason. Because again, why then we should be shooting everyone at the same rate? It shouldn't be this rate of shooting people of color more than others. And I've been in on shootings where I've seen he didn't have to shoot. What did he shoot? And then of course he's going to articulate, well, I was afraid, I was scared. Even if those things really wasn't the reason they shot. That's right. So that's the concern that I have here. Officers are shooting when they know that guy was running away from the man in South Carolina. I guarantee you when they sit down, he's going to say all kinds of things that he felt and believed the reason why he fired his weapon. And we need to address that. And that's a psychological issue.
That's absolutely right.
And can I just add to that? I think it's important when we're addressing those stigmas surrounding racial fears, we also have to address the stigmas and discrimination surrounding disability, mental illness. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are 7 times more likely to interact with the police departments. These are things that really have to be addressed, again, simultaneously. We cannot talk about racial justice without talking about disability justice, because I am a disabled black person and I live this experience simultaneously. You cannot separate those things. So I think it's really important that we talk about disability justice and racial justice as it relates to police departments and policing.
Thank you. Commissioner Arasaki, you have the last questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make a short statement too, and that is I want to thank staff for really putting together such an excellent panel, and you have me to blame for the fact that this panel is kind of large, because I felt it was important to have the disability community voice here, and I want to appreciate staff for making that happen. But in the negotiations, because we already had such packed panels, we weren't able to add an Asian American. So I just want to note a few things about why they are also important to this conversation before I ask a couple questions. I promise to be really short. I find this discussion very challenging, because obviously when you're talking about use of force, both police and the communities they serve have very legitimate concerns. And change clearly has proven to be extremely difficult, because we've been having this discussion for decades. That's right. And we have not made meaningful advancement. Last year in New York, an 84-year-old Asian immigrant who did not speak English ended up hospitalized after an altercation with police who were trying to initially give him a ticket just for jaywalking. The mayor had asked the police to aggressively ticket jaywalkers in this particular community because of a series of recent pedestrian deaths. He was beaten after he tried to walk away because he didn't understand the police instructions who was trying to write the ticket. And that's, I think, an example of everyday things that somehow escalate to something larger when they really apparently shouldn't be escalated to that level. We know that police risk their lives every day. But they also need to have accountability measures that takes into account their concerns about their own safety and the safety of those around them. Community members need the police to protect them and enforce our laws, but they need to be able to trust the police if they're going to partner with them effectively in that job. And we understand that the police are in danger of losing the legitimacy and cooperation they need if the community cannot trust them, as we've just heard. The murders of the NYPD officers Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos highlight the dangers that our police face every day. And the shooting by NYPD officer Peter Liang of Akai Gurley, innocently walking up the stairs with his girlfriend, shows the danger that minorities, particularly African Americans and those with disabilities, face every day. The tragedy there apparently was at least in part the result of 2 rookie cops, perhaps without sufficient field training, being thrown into NYPD's most perilous assignments of patrolling the dark stairwells of a high-crime project in order to stem the rise in shootings in public housing. Again, good intentions, but unfortunately bad results. And I think it's important for us to remember that both black and blue lives matter. And the challenge that I want to put to you all on this panel is, as I said earlier, we've been having this conversation. Some technology is new. We have tasers now. We have video, affordable on-body cameras. But other than that, it seems to me that the biggest issue is cultural change, how the police look at policing. And what is it that is going to cause the cultural shift that all of you seem to agree need to happen? What, when you talk about the blue wall, I can see how that happens. If you're protecting someone's back every day, you're going to have their back. You're going to give them the deference of their opinion because you're buds. How do you break that down? And when you talk about having meaningful witness protection, what does that actually look like? So that is what I'm very interested in, this transformative issue. And I think what we have to transform is the culture, because you could have every kind of protocol that looks pretty on the books, but if people aren't actually going to follow them with the right intent, I think we're not going to have any different results.
I was just going to say that, a lot of people remember the Abner Louima situation in New York here where the guy was sodomized by the plunger. Everybody was saying this was a horrific act. But everybody missed the point that the police officers brought him into the police station, had him in the bathroom, which means they knew that other commanders and other people could come in and see him. That's what I was concentrating on. The other day when we had half the police department in New York turn their back on the commander-in-chief, that should tell everybody that is a culture out of control. So how do we get that culture into control? The first thing you have to do is bring in people who are in leadership and hold them accountable. They've got to be held accountable to the point that where when something happens down that rank and file, you see it in the Army all the time, let somebody get out of control in that rank and file, that commander is gone. So when he knows his back is against the wall, he's going to make certain that his men are doing it by the book as much as possible and making certain the training and everything is constantly saying you have to do it by the book the way we've been taught to do it, whether you like it or not. Not none of that stuff. When you come out of the academy, like I heard, I know you learned all that training, but this is how we do it here. When we saw that guy get beat crazily out there in California, everybody see the helicopter. The officers know that they're being filmed. And they still are kicking and punching this man, kicking him in the groin and everything you can think of. And all America's watching this on video. We saw Eric Gardner get choked to death in New York City. They used a chokehold that was already outlawed by the police department, but yet the officers weren't even indicted. So what I'm saying to you is we got to first attack it from that perspective, that the officers, command officers, have to be held accountable. And when something like that happens, they got to go. Just like in the Secret Service, we've been hearing what's happening in the Secret Service. First thing they did was got rid of the first commander and they brought in a new person. Now that person's under the gun because that culture behind him has to change. And you got to really put some real heat on the commanders to say, you will change it or you'll lose your job. I think that's the first thing.
Mr. Vargas, and then Mr. Smoot, and then we're going to need to wrap up because we have the second panel, some of whom have to leave a little early.
Commissioner, we do need a cultural sea of change. We need for our police to look at themselves as the community looks at them, and that is what's lacking right now. I've been saying all along.
But what is actually going to do that, though? We all understand what the culture needs to be.
Yes, let me respond to that. It begins with a recognition, with some introspection on the part of our police, that there are some serious gaps and serious ways that they need to self-correct. It begins with that recognition that I've got a problem.
But how are you going to get them to recognize that? I just saw there was just a recent report about a web blog by former, current and retired police where they're openly calling the citizens here calling black citizens apes.
Well, I'll tell you how it's going to start.
Using racial slurs
It's
against
gonna start
Puerto
with me
Ricans.
sitting down with that man over
attacking drivers.
It's going to begin with me sitting down with that man over there, Chief Metzger, and saying, Chief, do you recognize that you have a problem in Pasco? If he says, no, I don't have a problem, then nothing's going to get resolved. So we need first to see the same issues. We have an opportunity. The Department of Justice Community Relations Service is going to start a mediation soon in Pasco. So we're going to sit across the table from each other. We're going to identify issues, and we're going to go through a process of looking at it line by line to see if we understand what it is we're talking about. And then we're going to look at possibly putting together a game plan where we understand each other. And this is going to be a community-wide effort. So we have an opportunity, perhaps in my little town in southeastern Washington, to make some changes, bring about some of this cultural change, which could be applicable in other parts of the country. So I hate to say this, but I'm optimistic. I think we can actually get someplace. We have an opportunity to get things right and to start the healing process now. But it all begins with people talking to each other and having goodwill.
I feel like a lot of chiefs may understand and may want to address the issue. I'm wondering how you get the line cops to be bought into the fact that, because ultimately the institution is made up of the people who are doing the job every day.
Commissioner, I'm going to ask Mr. Smoot to answer that, and that'll be the last response, because we really do need to start with panel two. I apologize.
Thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity to respond. I think the first way you get the rank and file to buy in is by inviting them to the conversation, which doesn't happen. And I think something that holds out significant hope for me to transform culture, and maybe it has to be done department by department, state by state. I hope not, but it might. Is the collaborative reform process that the COPS office has started doing in various jurisdictions. You know, the culture of policing needs to be changed from a sentinel mindset, a soldier mindset, a military mindset, to institution that at its core is based on procedural justice and legitimacy. And that procedural justice and legitimacy has to be inside the department as well as outside. You heard earlier testimony about how people were treated differently within the department. How would you expect somebody who works in that department to go outside and treat people the way they should be treated? And so things like quotas, profiling based on race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, those things degrade not only procedural justice in the public, but procedural justice and legitimacy within departments. And so I think that's really, we need to get at the core, and it's got to start with collaborative processes now that include police officers, line rank and file officers, and we need to start training officers from day one at the academy on a training model that's a guardian training model based on procedural justice and internal and external legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. And thanks to each of the panelists. This was extremely informative, and we appreciate it. Hopefully you'll be able to stick around and watch some of the other panels. Thank you for your time. As the first panel begins to step away, we'll ask members of the second panel to begin to come forward while Ms. Dunstan changes the nameplates, and then we will start immediately upon their seating.
Yes, I am.
Yes, they do deserve a round of applause. Thank you.